r/nosleep. Posted by you/saint_circa. The house on McKinley. My childhood was something that I think most people would consider unstable. Dad was gone, and as much as I'd like to say that Mom stepped up to the plate and did the right things to be a good role model for me, she just didn't. Looking back now, I don't even think she really tried. I stayed fed for the most part, and I stayed clothed for the most part, but I can safely say I spent the majority of my childhood feeling like an inconvenient burden at best, and things were seldom at their best. It never made sense to me. Even as an adult, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you have kids just to hate them? I guess that's probably why I took a liking to the Thompsons as much as I did. I was about 14, maybe 15, when my mother decided to once again uproot our lives and drive us clear across Ohio to the little town of Queville. It was your typical Ohio factory town. An historic Old West-looking downtown, a Walmart that the teenagers would hang out at every night for some reason, and between all that were mostly just houses. Kids would hang out with kids in the same neighborhood as them. Most of them had known each other since they were infants. I guess looking back, it was no surprise that I had trouble making friends in an environment like that. I mean, how many times have you seen a greasy-haired, cigarette-smoking, fight-starting kid all laden in black and thought, "Gee whiz, I'd sure like to see if that guy wants to be my friend"? How many times has a parent seen a kid like that and thought, "Well, golly gee willikers. That looks like exactly the type of character my child should be around"? As you can well guess, my first couple weeks in Queville were pretty lonely, and being an already hormonal teenage boy uprooted from his home for the 100th time, there wasn't a lot that I looked forward to at all. The Thompsons, though, they were different. They lived across the street and to the right of me. I guess you'd call that cat-a-corner? A mom and one boy around my age. Just like my family. Well, just like my family if my family had any semblance of stability whatsoever. I remember the day that I met Ms. Thompson. I was walking through a back alley behind her house smoking a Marlboro I had lifted out of Mom's pack, when she came into view with a trash bag in her hand. I thought I'd stepped back into the 1950s. "You look like a regular greaser," she said with a laugh. I didn't know what a greaser was, but ashamed of an adult having caught me smoking, I threw the cigarette out and began to apologize. "You just moved here, right? The little yellow house across the street?" "Yeah," I responded. "With my mom." "Oh yes," Ms. Thompson said with the same tone I'd heard so many times from so many different people from so many different towns. We haven't met her, but we've heard her a few times." Though this remark would probably offend most kids. It was a comment that I had heard more than a few times. My mom and her boyfriends would get into fights, and they would always take those fights outside for the entire neighborhood to witness. I couldn't tell you how many neighbors I'd seen poking their heads out of doors, and through window blinds. The same look of annoyance and concern. The police had been called several times already in the few months that we had been living in Queville, and were already on a first-name basis with my mom. "You know, my mama and daddy used to fight a lot too." "He's not my dad," I interjected with an air of hostility. "He's just some guy my mom met. He'll be gone in a few months and so will we." I remember Ms. Thompson staying silent for several moments. I'd had people look at me with annoyance, I'd had people look at me with disdain. I'd even had people look at me with pity, but the look I saw on Ms. Thompson's face in the alley behind her house was something I was almost foreign to. It was a look I had seen in maybe 2 or 3 other people in my life. It was a look of compassion. "Fair enough," Ms. Thompson finally replied. Not an angry tone to be found despite my childish outburst. "But you know this and know it good. You come over here whenever you want, you understand me? You can always get away from it here. Why don't you come over tonight for supper? We're having some meatloaf and mashed potatoes with greens. I'll save you a plate." I don't know what convinced me to go to the Thompsons' house that night for dinner. Maybe it was the look she gave me, maybe it was the sincerity of her offer, or maybe it was just to find out what greens were, but as I sat at their table, and ate their delicious food, and listened to them laugh and make jokes and pray before they ate, I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the complete normalcy and genuine wholesomeness I was a part of. When they asked me about where I was from, and what things were like for me, and how I was getting settled into the new town, I expected the laughter to stop, I expected whatever accidental deception I had pulled on Ms. Thompson to come to light. For the table to get uncomfortably quiet or to be asked to leave. "Child, we've been that family in this little town for the better part of 60 years now," Ms. Thompson said with a laugh as she flipped her hand in a fluid motion, almost dismissing the gravity of what I'd told her. "Everyone around here's nice enough, but we know what it's like to feel like the outsiders. You just come around whenever you want. There's always a plate for you here." And so commenced what was undoubtedly the best summer I had ever had. Ms. Thompson's son Elijah was the same age as me, and we would spend hours playing out in their yard. Throwing baseball, drinking Ms. Thompson's amazing homemade lemonade, catching fireflies in the evening, and lounging around in his room on rainy days. Ms. Thompson was always happy to see me. She'd give me a big hug every time I saw her. She never turned me away, she was never too busy to talk to me, and she remembered everything. For the first time in my life, I actually felt wanted. I'd be a liar if I said it felt more than good, and even now after everything that's happened, I still find myself smiling when I think about the memories I had with that family. How she'd sing old hymns while she cooked food in the wonderful smelling kitchen, how she'd kiss my head goodnight when I slept over just as she did with Elijah. I really felt like I was her son. Like I was part of her family. To be wanted and loved in such a way felt amazing to say the least. That was until school started. Elijah was homeschooled, and I was pretty worried about going to a new school without knowing anyone, but my first day went surprisingly well. No one really bothered me at all, and a few of my teachers seemed actually pretty impressed with some of the things that I knew academic-wise. Especially my history teacher and my English teacher. As I was walking home from the bus stop after school, I approached Ms. Thompson's house and decided that I would go in and tell her about how my day went. Maybe see if Elijah wanted to come out and play. As I walked up to the house and put my hand on the front door, I heard the voice of one of the kids I was walking with from behind me. "Dude, what are you doing?" Turning around, I saw that the group of kids I had been walking with were giving me strange looks. Like they couldn't understand why I was going up to this house. "I'm friends with the people that live here," I said, trying to ease their obvious confusion and concern. "They're super cool. I'm just gonna tell them how my day went." Several of the kids furrowed their brows at the remark. A few looked at each other with nervous glances. With a few long and drawn-out okays, they made their way down the street, leaving me to my business. I could see several of them glancing back periodically as they walked their way down the street and out of sight. "Don't mind them," Ms. Thompson told me upon mentioning it to her over pork chops and corn on the cob that evening. "Kids are cruel and hateful sometimes. That's why my son stays away from them." Even though my time with the Thompson family remained as good as ever, I began to notice that people in the town were becoming more and more leery and hostile around me. Sometimes I'd see them whispering and pointing in my direction. Kids went out of their way to not talk to me, and even some of their parents, and some of the teachers in my school would give me strange looks, or usher their kids away from me really quick when they'd see me entering or leaving the house. It was midway through September when I got summoned to the principal's office. Thinking that I was in trouble, I braced for the inevitable detentions or suspensions coming my way and racked my mind to think of what I could have done wrong that the principal would even be mad about. As I sat in the cushioned chair across from his desk, I didn't see a look of anger about him, but a look of surprising genuine concern. "How are you getting situated in the new school?" he asked me with an almost too soft voice. I knew instantly that he was dodging around what he really wanted to talk about. Jumping around me like I was some sort of venomous snake. "It's going all right, I guess." Noticeable anxiousness in my voice. "The kids treat me like a weirdo, but I'm kind of used to that." Yeah. So, look. I called you in here today because I've gotten some pretty concerning calls. A few students and their parents tell me that you've been spending a lot of time at a house on McKinley Avenue? "Yeah, the Thompsons." I responded with a growing irritability. Incapable of seeing what the problem with that was. "They're my neighbors. I'm friends with her son. They've been nothing but nice to me. What are you trying to get at?" An indistinguishable pause of confusion permeated the room. The principal just stared at me, his chin down toward his chest and his eyes staring at me over his glasses propped low on his nose. After a few uncomfortable moments of what seemed like deliberation, he wrote something down on a piece of paper and addressed me once more. "I don't want to hear about you being over there ever again, do you understand me? If I get another call, I'm going to have to call the police. Do we understand each other?" "What the hell are you talking about?" I stated sharply, standing up from my seat. "You can't tell me where to go after SCO. That's a week's detention. Keep it up. This conversation is over." After school, I told Mrs. Thompson about what happened. She shook her head and simply stated, "You're always welcome here. You ought to know that much by now." The next day at school, I was pulled out of lunch and spent the better part of 2 periods talking with the school counselor. She asked me about my home life, asked me about my parents, and asked a lot of questions about the time I spent at the Thompsons' house. She asked about who they were, how long I'd known them. She asked me questions about Elijah and his mother. With each question, the counselor grew more and more concerned, which in turn resulted in me growing more and more withdrawn and agitated. Friday night, I stayed over at Ms. Thompson's house with Elijah. She could tell something was bothering me but didn't pry as to what. She was always good about that. Before I went to bed, she came in and kissed me on my forehead and closed the door behind her. I drifted off to sleep, forgetting about the assholes at school. There's no way a family like this could be bad. For the first time in my life, nothing was wrong. I awoke several hours later to a bright light in my face. Quavel police. Come out of there. My first initial thoughts, aside from what the fuck of course, was a wondering as to why it was so cold in the house. I pulled the blanket off of me and noticed it felt substantially different than it had when I'd gone to sleep. What was a nice warm blanket was now a ragged, ratty thing. Damp and foul smelling. I felt myself itching all over as I stood up. For some reason the floor was covered in what felt like dirt and grime and dust. I sneezed as my movements kicked it up and the particles invaded my nostrils. The house was unnaturally quiet. Not a sound could be heard. Elijah, who normally snored, was sitting up in his bed, or at least what was left of it. It was now nothing more than a rotted bed frame. No mattress to be found. Before I could figure out what was happening, I felt strong arms grab me and pull me out of the house. Careful on the stairs. They're about to fall through. I heard one man say to another as we thumped down the dusty stairs that groaned with agony at every step. As we approached the bottom of the stairs, I saw the shadow of Ms. Thompson in the darkness, standing at the end of the hallway near the kitchen and back door. No one seemed to pay her any mind, and she did not move an inch. Just stood there in the darkness. Stop. What are you doing? I didn't do anything. What the fuck is wrong with you people? The grasp on my arm tightened as I was practically thrown outside. Red and blue lights made the world around me disorienting and surreal, like everything was some sort of carnival funhouse. As the uniformed men I now recognized as cops pulled me down the porch stairs to their cruiser, I could see the neighbors pointing at the house from their front porches, peeking their faces out from the blinds of their windows. I screamed and kicked as the officers opened the back door and tried to put me in the back of the cruiser. As I turned around in the struggle, trying to get back to the Thompsons' house, I looked up and gasped in shock and horror. Where there had once been a beautiful Victorian-style house, there was now only a burned-out and decayed skeleton of a home. The glass in the windows had been broken long ago. The window frames reflecting moonlight like crucifixes in a square. The porch was beveled and caved in. The whole house seemed to lean to the right on its ruined foundation. The paint had been burned away from the house. Large streaks of soot-black stains could still be seen on areas that used to be a beautiful shade of white. The lawn was overgrown, and it was obvious no one could have possibly been living there for a long time. I looked down and realized that my clothes were covered. I was covered. Black in dirt and dust and ash from head to toe. I screamed in shock and utter disbelief as I was pushed into the back of the cruiser and sent away. As I looked at the house once more, I could see the silhouettes of Ms. Thompson and Elijah standing at the front door. Unmoving apparitions in a ruined threshold. Posted by you/Saint_Circa. Guard dog. Relax. Riley's chiding voice broke the eerie silence of the cemetery as she nudged me on the shoulder. We've been hanging out here since 7th grade and no one's caught us yet. As Riley foraged through her purse, I peered around the mausoleum and glanced around at the still and unmoving tombstones of the old Logan Cemetery. Our hiding spot behind the mausoleum at the top of the hill allowed us to see the entirety of the area around us. If the sun was up, you could probably see the whole town from here, but then of course the whole town would be able to see us too. You want a hit of this? Riley's sudden voice and touch on my shoulder made me jump involuntarily with nervousness, causing her to stifle a laughter as she held a lit and smoldering joint in her hand. Are you serious? I asked as she took a drag, ensuing a series of loud coughing as she tried to expel the substance from her lungs. Are you trying to get us caught? Want me to come back up here with some symbols or something? Oh my god, you're such a weenie. Riley grunted through exasperated breaths. No one's going to come up here, and if they do, we'll be able to see them from the time they walk in. What did you think we were going to do up here? Tell ghost stories? Looking back down towards the bottom of the hill and the front gate of the cemetery, I began to relax a little bit. Riley was always a little reckless, but it was hard not to see her logic here. If a bored police officer wanted to drive up here to look for weed-smoking teenagers, his headlights would be a dead giveaway, and if some groundskeeper got a call about people being up here somehow, he'd give himself away just as easily. Okay, fuck it. I resigned to Riley's antics, reaching my hand out towards the bright orange ember in her hand. Let me hit that. That's the spirit, champ. As I inhaled the odorous smoke from the end of the joint, my lungs and throat became hot and strained with the invasion of the foreign substance, caused me to have a coughing fit of my own. After several minutes of passing the joint back and forth between the two of us, we were feeling good, more than good honestly. As crickets chirped and fireflies danced around the macabre memorials all around us, we moved to the shadow of the ancient oak tree that stood at the peak of hill. We sat with our backs against the firm bark-covered base of the tree and gazed at the lights of the town beyond us, and the endless fields of stars above it. "Wow, that's something else, isn't it?" Riley asked as she edged closer to me. I put my arms over her shoulders and wrapped them around her as she leaned back, sitting between my legs and against my chest. "Now it is," I chuckled softly as I continued to stare off towards the horizon. "You're so sappy," Riley responded softly as she leaned her head back and kissed me. "I kind of like it though." This wasn't a half-bad idea. The weed had me feeling pretty good, admittedly, but it was moments like this that really got a person high. It was amid these feelings of young love and adventure that we heard it. Somewhere the bottom of the hill, concealed behind the mess of gravestones, we could hear the low and angry growling of something in the shadows. Tensing up and staring wide-eyed, we listened intently as we tried to discern where the sound was coming from, and what was making the sound. "What the hell is that?" Riley whispered sharply, making me jump, as concern began to replace the good moods of the night. The cemetery had seemed to change all around us. What was once a mess of unassuming stones had now become a leering, a malicious labyrinth of silhouettes. Every stone was now a hiding place for whatever fearsome thing was making itself known. As we sat rigid at the base of the tree, the growling grew louder and fiercer as the source made its way up the hill, seemingly transfixed to our location. "It sounds like a dog," I responded shakily to Riley's question, a big one. "I don't like this. Let's get out of here." No sooner had she suggested an escape when the looming outline of the large and menacing dog came into view around a large tombstone less than a few feet away from where we were sitting, its head low and its pointed ears pressed back against its head. The growls turned into sharp snarls as its green eyes reflected horribly in the darkness like ghostly orbs in the distance. "Get out of here. Go. Get out of here." I stood up and shouted at the beast, waving my arms and trying to look big. The dog remained where it stood, undeterred by my attempts to frighten it off. As another gust of cold wind cascaded its way through the headstones, I caught the smell of something awful. The pungent and sickening smell of something rotten and dead. A loud bark from the dog seemed to stop the wind in its path. The crickets had stopped chirping. The fireflies had vanished. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath, trying to make itself small and insubstantial to the predator before it. "Riley," I whispered as the shadowed dog began to inch towards us with deliberate and fearsome steps. "Oh my God, oh my God. What do we do? What do we do?" She half screamed, half whispered back to me, her shoulders rising up and down as she trembled at the sight before her. I looked around desperately as I tried to find some sort of escape from what was certain to be a viscous attack, trying to keep some sort of focus on the dog's movements as I did. Just as I thought all hope was lost, I saw it. Off in the distance, about 100 feet away, was the slightly ajar door of a mausoleum. "Riley, do you see that mausoleum there? With the open door?" As her head carefully turned towards the direction I was looking, she gazed across the graveyard tensely for a few moments before nodding her head in affirmation. No other words needed spoken. Without another moment's hesitation, we took off at a full sprint towards the small stone building. My legs felt like they were made of sand as the loud barks and heavy footfalls of the dog drew closer and closer. Within moments I could smell the rotting essence of the beast right behind us, its fire-hot breaths panting with feral hunger at our heels. I pulled Riley to the side and across a set of tombstones as the creature caught up with us, attempting to feign its movements with the sudden change of direction. The creature stumbled slightly as it shot past us, but quickly recovered its footing and continued its hellish pursuit. As we reached the door of the mausoleum, we threw ourselves over the threshold, crashing hard against the cold stone floor as we tumbled over each other trying to seek solace. Adrenaline coursing through me, I turned around and slammed the iron cage-style door shut as the wild dog slammed against the heavy bars. The door jolted open for a second as my body recoiled from the impact. I threw my shoulder back into the door, slamming it shut with a loud resounding crash that seemed to fill the tomb. Before the dog could charge itself for another attack, I flipped the rusted locking mechanism on the door and backed away from the exposing gaps. As we screamed from the back of the musty stone structure, the dog made several more attempts to breach the door, throwing itself against the bars with brute strength, swiping its sharpened paws through the gap at the bottom of the door and snarling ferociously as it tried to press itself through the bars. The longer I sat cowered in the back of the mausoleum, the more I noticed the horrifying details I had somehow missed in the moments before our siege. It had seemed that the dog had grown 3 times larger than it had initially been when we'd first seen it. What was the outline of a German Shepherd type breed of dog had now become more akin to a wolf, or at least what was left of a wolf. Its fur hung matted and torn all over its mangled and scarred body. Dark and disgusting looking gashes could be seen all over the creature, creating what looked like endless cavities all over its body. One ear had been torn off its head entirely, the other remained a clipped and distorted mess poking out of the side of its head. Its snout had been skinned to the bone. The clacking of the skeletal snout made a grotesque clicking sound as it slid against the iron-barred door. Its long sharp teeth jutting out of the jaw like stalagmites on a cavern floor. I blinked dumbfoundedly at the abomination, certain that I was seeing things in my fearful state. "What the fuck is that? What's wrong with it?" Riley screamed at the top of her lungs, snapping me out of my horrified trance. What I was seeing was real. Gripped by fear, we had barricaded in the mausoleum for hours. The creature constantly and unrelentingly attempting to break into our enclosure to devour us. As the sun began to rise and the darkness began to dwindle, however, the creature stumbled off weakly and disappeared behind a group of lonely tombstones that seemed isolated from the others. We waited for another hour at least, not believing that the creature was gone, worried that we'd be ambushed as soon as we opened the door, but as morning birds began to sing and the voices of early visitors to the graveyard began to resonate from somewhere beyond our hiding place, we braced and gathered what little courage we had left. Throwing the door open violently, we sprinted like madmen down the hill and back to our car. As we learned last week, science was an extremely rudimentary concept to Europeans during the Dark Ages. Instead, religion was king, and the majority of European decisions and knowledges resulted in this theological understanding of the world around them. Several days after the incident at the graveyard, I found myself sitting in history class, barely listening to the lesson the teacher was giving. Even though we'd escaped the graveyard, my mind was still attempting in vain to process the things that we had seen the other night. "You were baked. It was dark. You were scared," I told myself, trying to find some sort of real-world solution to the horrors we'd seen. "It was just a rabid dog with mange or something. It probably wandered off and died." As the history teacher droned on, my heart sank as my ears attentively caught his next words. "As a result of this, religion rules society. Europeans often did things that nowadays we would find strange. For instance, it was widely believed that when a graveyard was first established, the first person who was buried there would be doomed to wander the cemetery, guarding the other corpses from intruders and grave robbers. To attempt to loophole this torturous fate, before any one person was buried in a new cemetery, the early Europeans would first kill and bury a dog to guard the graves for them.